Pat Garrett learned everything he knew about killing from Billy the Kid. Not from training, not from the law, from 3 years of riding together through New Mexico, sharing fires and whiskey and secrets that neither man was supposed to survive long enough to repeat. If you want to follow Billy the Kid's full story, don't go anywhere. Subscribe on channel and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. A new chapter drops every week. Billy showed him the trick in 1878. He called it reading the room before the room reads you. It wasn't fast draw, it wasn't marksmanship, it was something simpler and more dangerous than either. It was the ability to enter a space, identify every exit, every man with a reason to lie, and position yourself so that when the moment came, you were already where you needed to be before anyone else realized the moment had arrived. Billy did it instinctively. He'd been doing it since he was a teenager with nothing but survival instincts and a reputation that grew faster than his age. Garrett was a student who paid attention. On July 14, 1881, Pat Garrett walked into a dark bedroom at Fort Sumner, New Mexico. He didn't announce himself. He didn't give Billy a warning. He positioned himself in the exact spot Billy had taught him to stand, in the shadow, against the wall, where a man entering from light couldn't see him until it was already over. Billy the Kid was 21 years old. He walked into that room and never walked out. The man who killed him had learned to do it from him. That is the story. Now here's everything that makes it impossible. In 1878, Billy the Kid was 18 years old and already had a body count. The Lincoln County War had turned southeastern New Mexico into a killing ground, and Billy had picked a side, the Tunstall-McSween faction against the Santa Fe Ring, and survived when almost everyone around him didn't. He'd seen his employer John Tunstall murdered in front of him. He'd watched his friends die one by one during a gunfight that lasted 5 days and ended with the burning of the McSween house. He came out of Lincoln County with 3 things: wanted posters with his name on them, a reputation that made lawmen nervous, and an instinct for survival that men twice his age couldn't teach. Pat Garrett was 28. He was tall, unusually tall for the frontier, and sharp in the way men who grew up poor and hungry are sharp. He drifted through Louisiana, Texas, and New Mexico doing work that paid and surviving situations that shouldn't have let him. He was smart enough to know he needed allies, and perceptive enough to recognize that the most dangerous man in the territory was also, at that moment, the most useful one to know. They met in Fort Sumner sometime around 1878. The exact introduction isn't recorded, which tells you something. When Billy the Kid introduced himself to people he intended to kill, they tended to remember it. When he introduced himself to people he intended to trust, the details got quiet and personal. What happened between 1878 and 1880 was 2 men building the kind of friendship that the frontier actually ran on. Not sentiment, not loyalty in the storybook sense, but a mutual understanding. You're useful to me, I'm useful to you. And right now, we're more dangerous together than apart. They gambled together, they drank together, they worked cattle together on the same ranches, sometimes legally, sometimes not. Billy introduced Garrett to his network, the Hispanic ranching families of the Pecos Valley, who trusted Billy in ways they trusted almost nobody else. That network was worth more than money. It was information, shelter, and warning when warning was needed. In exchange, Garrett gave Billy something less tangible but just as valuable, a version of himself that could sit in a room with respectable men and hold a conversation that didn't end with someone reaching for iron. Garrett was presentable. He understood the political landscape of New Mexico territory in ways that Billy, who had chosen bullets over compromise, didn't have the patience for. 2 men, 3 years, a friendship that worked because both of them knew exactly what the other one was. And during those 3 years, Billy taught Garrett the trick. It happened more than once because the trick wasn't a single technique, it was a philosophy built out of hard experience and hard lessons. Billy would enter a saloon, a trading post, a stranger's home, and before he sat down, before he accepted a drink, before he said a single word beyond hello, he had already cataloged everything in the room, where the doors were, where the windows were, who was sitting with their back to the wall versus who had left themselves exposed, who was watching him with too much interest, who was pretending not to watch him at all, which man's hand was resting too close to his weapon, which man's eyes moved to his companions before answering a question. Then he would position himself. Not obviously, not in the theatrical way that dime novelists described, no dramatic stance, no hand hovering over the holster. Billy sat down like any man sat down, relaxed and conversational. But he was always in the shadow when he could be, always facing the door when possible, always with his back protected and his options open. Garrett watched this for months before he understood what he was seeing. "You're always the last one to be surprised," he said one night, according to accounts from men who knew both of them. Billy's answer, as it was remembered, surprises are for people who weren't paying attention. The specific detail that made this a lesson rather than just an observation was what Billy added next. He explained that most men in a conflict situation spend all their energy on the conflict. They focus on the man they're worried about, watch that man's hands, track that man's movement. What they don't do is control the space around the conflict. They let the room happen to them instead of happening to the room. Billy's version was the opposite. He controlled the geometry of every situation he entered. By the time a conflict became visible to everyone else, Billy was already standing in the place where winning was easiest. The draw, the shot, the decision, those were the last 10% of a gunfight. The first 90% was positioning, and that happened before anyone's hand moved. Garrett was a good student. He had the patience that Billy sometimes lacked and the political ambition to understand that this skill was worth more than just survival. A man who controlled rooms could control more than rooms. He remembered everything. In November 1880, Pat Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico. The governor who pushed for his election was Lew Wallace, the same governor who had offered Billy the Kid amnesty 2 years earlier, then failed to deliver on the promise and left Billy facing murder charges he'd been promised would disappear. Wallace wanted Billy dead or in prison. He needed someone who could do it, someone who knew Billy's network, Billy's habits, Billy's thinking. The obvious choice was the man who had spent 3 years learning all three. The bounty on Billy the Kid was $500. That was real money in 1880, roughly what a working cohond made in a year. But the historical record suggests money wasn't the primary calculation for Garrett. He was a political animal, and he understood that capturing or killing Billy the Kid wasn't just a paycheck, it was a career. The sheriff who brought in the most wanted outlaw in New Mexico territory would have leveraged that $500 couldn't buy. Billy found out about Garrett's appointment almost immediately. The Pecos Valley network that Garrett had access through Billy now ran information in both directions. Billy knew his old riding partner was the new sheriff. He knew what that meant. He knew Garrett knew where he went, who he trusted, how he thought. What the historical record shows in the months that followed is a chase between two men who understood each other almost completely and who both knew it. Billy didn't run far or fast, which confused outsiders who didn't understand the calculation. He stayed in the territory he knew, among people who protected him, moving between the same dozen locations he'd always used. This looked like arrogance from outside. From inside, it was the same principle he'd always operated on. Unfamiliar ground was more dangerous than familiar ground with known risks. He trusted his network. He trusted his red on every room he entered. What he didn't account for was that Garrett had learned to read rooms too. In December 1880, Garrett and a posse caught up with Billy and his gang at Stinking Springs, New Mexico. The ambush was planned with a precision that should have felt familiar to Billy if he'd been watching for it. Garrett used darkness, positioning, and patience. He controlled the geometry of the situation before Billy's group knew a situation existed. When shooting started, Billy's friend Charlie Bowdre walked out the door first and was killed immediately. Billy surrendered. It was the first time he'd been successfully caught since the Lincoln County War. He was transported to Mesilla, tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang in Lincoln on May 13, 1881. He had roughly 5 months to live. What happened at the Lincoln County Courthouse on April 28, 1881 is the story inside the story, and it matters here because it shows exactly the kind of man Pat Garrett was hunting, and why the method Garrett eventually used was the only one that could work. Billy the Kid was being held on the second floor of the courthouse, chained at the wrists and ankles, guarded by 2 deputies, James Bell and Bob Olinger. He was 2 weeks from the gallows. Every professional calculation said this was finished. Olinger despised Billy. He made it personal and vocal and physical in the way men do when they're trying to cover their fear with contempt. He taunted Billy daily, made a point of displaying his shotgun, a 10-gauge, double-barreled weapon that he called My Beauty, and told Billy repeatedly how he planned to use it if Billy tried anything. Olinger left the courthouse at noon to take lunch across the street, leaving Bell as the only guard. 18 minutes later, Bob Olinger heard a voice call his name from the window above him. He looked up. Billy the Kid was standing in the window with Olinger's own shotgun. "Hello, Bob," Witnesses reported Billy saying, "Both barrels." Bollinger was dead before he hit the ground. Bell had already been shot with his own revolver. The precise mechanics of how Billy got it are still debated, and was dead at the bottom of the courthouse stairs. Billy had been chained in a building with 2 armed guards and no allies, and he had turned one man's weapon on its owner and used another man's pride against him. He controlled the geometry, he read the room, he found the opening that existed in every situation if you were patient enough and perceptive enough to wait for it. He rode out of Lincoln on a stolen horse while the entire town watched and nobody stopped him. The legend was at its peak, but peaks are where falls begin. Garrett received word of the escape and didn't panic. People around him expected urgency, a massive manhunt, the kind of organized chase that newspapers could follow. Garrett did something different. He went quiet. He went back to the network. He understood something about Billy that the reward hunters and the eager posses didn't. Billy wasn't going to run to Mexico, even though Mexico was right there and could have given him safety. Billy was going to go back to the people he trusted, the Pecos Valley families. Fort Sumner, the world he knew. Because Billy's entire operational philosophy was built on familiar ground and trusted relationships, it was exactly what had kept him alive for years. It was what Garrett had learned by watching him, and it was, in the summer of 1881, exactly the thing that was going to get him killed. Garrett waited. He gathered information carefully, using contacts he hadn't burned, asking questions sideways rather than directly. He narrowed it down, and by mid-July 1881, he had reliable information that Billy was staying somewhere around Fort Sumner, New Mexico, the place where Billy had first taught him the trick, in the same community of people who had been their shared network for 3 years. Garrett arrived at Fort Sumner on the night of July 13, 1881. He didn't announce himself. He didn't assemble a visible posse. He controlled the geometry. Pete Maxwell was a rancher in Fort Sumner who knew Billy well and knew Garrett even better. On the night of July 13, Garrett went to Maxwell's house and let himself into the bedroom, a calculated move, private and quiet, the kind of conversation that doesn't leave witnesses standing in doorways. He was asking Maxwell for information about Billy's location. He was sitting on the edge of Maxwell's bed, in the dark, with his back against the wall and the door visible. He was in the shadow, facing the entry point. It was the position Billy had taught him. Billy was somewhere on the property that night. He had been visiting. Fort Sumner was exactly the kind of familiar, trusted place his operational philosophy pointed him toward. He came to Maxwell's house at what the historical record puts as somewhere past midnight, moving through the darkness barefoot, a practice he'd apparently developed for moving quietly. He was carrying a butcher knife and a revolver. He had just cut a piece of beef from a hanging carcass outside. He walked through the door into Pete Maxwell's bedroom. The room was dark. He couldn't see clearly from the doorway. He could make out a figure on the bed, Maxwell, and something else, a shape against the wall that shouldn't have been there, a presence that didn't fit. "Quienes," he said. "Who is it?" The historical accounts agree on those words, 2 words in Spanish spoken in the darkness of a room where Billy the Kid had just walked into the one situation his philosophy was designed to prevent, entering a space without knowing what it contained, without controlling the geometry, without having positioned himself in the shadow before the moment arrived. The student had. Pat Garrett fired twice. The first shot hit Billy in the chest, directly above the heart. The second went into the wall. Billy the Kid was dead before he could process what had happened. He was 21 years old. The immediate aftermath was the kind of silence that happens when something impossible has just become real. Garrett left the room fast, not fleeing, assessing. He wasn't sure initially which shots had connected and what he was dealing with. The men with him outside confirmed what happened when no further sound came from the room. When they went back in with a light, Billy the Kid was on the floor, the revolver still in his hand, dead from a single shot that had found exactly the place a man cannot survive. The news traveled fast and arrived distorted. Early accounts said Garrett had shot Billy without warning, in the dark, from ambush. And this was essentially true, and it was why a significant portion of New Mexico territory greeted the news not with relief but with anger. Billy had friends. Billy had protected communities. Billy had been, to the Hispanic ranching families of the Pecos Valley, something closer to a protector than a criminal. The reward posters said outlaw. The people he'd lived among said something more complicated. Garrett was not celebrated in the way he expected. He claimed the reward. He wrote a book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, published in 1882, a deliberate attempt to control the narrative and justify the killing to an audience that was already beginning to turn the dead 21-year-old into something larger than any wanted poster could contain. The book did something interesting with the shooting. Garrett's account focused on the confrontation as a lawman doing his job, a fair resolution to a dangerous situation. What the book couldn't quite hide was the geometry of it. Garrett had used darkness, positioning, and the element of surprise in the same territory and against the same man who had first shown him that darkness, positioning, and surprise were the tools that kept you alive. The student had turned the lesson against the teacher. And the teacher had been 21 years old, barefoot, cutting beef in the dark, moving through familiar ground on a night that felt like every other night, right up until it didn't. The legend grew in the way legends do when the truth is both simpler and more disturbing than the myth. The dime novels started almost immediately. Within months of Billy's death, publications were churning out versions of his life that bore varying relationships to the documented record. He became faster, younger, more heroic, more villainous depending on who needed him to be what. The number of men he'd supposedly killed climbed from the historically documented 4 to 21, a number that became attached to him permanently, one kill for every year of his life, a detail too perfect for storytellers to abandon even after historians challenged it. What every version kept, because it was too good to remove and too true to deny, was the core impossibility of his life. A young man with no structural advantages, no money, no family, no political connections, no formal training, who survived situations that killed men with all of those things, survived them repeatedly, survived them against odds that should have been unsurvivable, and did it by being smarter in the ways that actually mattered in the specific geography and specific moment he existed in. The Lincoln County escape became the set piece everyone returned to. Chained, 2 guards, scheduled to hang, out in 18 minutes, both guards dead, rode away while the town watched. It was the moment that crystallized what Billy was, not superhuman, not a dime novel fantasy. Something more specific and more unnerving. A man who understood how situations actually work and used that understanding in ways other people couldn't track in real time. Pat Garrett's book sold modestly. His political career never reached what he expected. He was killed in 1908, shot, ironically, in a dispute over a land lease, by a man whose name was Wayne Brazel, under circumstances that remained legally murky and historically disputed for over a century. Some accounts suggested the shooting was arranged. The geometry of his death, like the geometry of Billy's death, involved darkness and uncertainty and a man who didn't see what was coming. The friendship they'd had, the 3 years of riding together, the moment one man taught another man the thing that ended up killing him, that part of the story was quieter than the gunfights. It didn't fit neatly into the hero-villain frame that both the reward posters and the dime novels required. But it was the real story. It was the impossible part. The historical documentation of Billy the Kid's life and death is more substantial than the legend suggests. Court records from the Lincoln County trials, the correspondence of Governor Lew Wallace, including letters he exchanged with Billy directly. Billy wrote to Wallace, by hand, negotiating for the amnesty that Wallace ultimately didn't deliver. The sworn testimonies from the Fort Sumner shooting, collected by a coroner's jury that convened within days of Billy's death and confirmed Garrett's account of events, while also placing Billy at the site and confirming the details of the shooting as Garrett described them. The friendship between Garrett and Billy is documented in the recollections of people who knew both men, ranchers, merchants, and residents of the Pecos Valley communities who saw them together repeatedly between 1878 and 1880. Ash Upson, who helped Garrett write his book, gathered first-hand accounts. Miguel Otero, who later became governor of New Mexico, wrote about Billy's reputation among the Hispanic communities and the nature of his relationships in the territory. The picture that emerges consistently is of a young man who was genuinely liked and trusted by people who had practical reasons to trust carefully, and who operated with a social and situational intelligence that didn't match the simple outlaw of the wanted posters. A specific technique described in this account, the room reading, the positional awareness, the geometric approach to conflict, isn't documented in those exact terms because the people of Lincoln County didn't write philosophy. But the pattern is there in every documented confrontation of Billy's life. He didn't die in Lincoln County when the Murphy faction had every advantage. He didn't die at Stinking Springs until Garrett applied the same principle against him. He survived the jail in Mesilla, the chains, the 2 armed guards, the imminent execution, because he controlled the geometry of a situation that every objective observer said was uncontrollable. He died in a dark room he'd walked into without looking first. The one time the principle failed was the one time it mattered most. The bedroom at the Maxwell Ranch in Fort Sumner no longer exists as it was. Fort Sumner became a small New Mexico town. Billy the Kid's grave is there, marked and fenced, visited by thousands of people every year who make the specific drive to stand at the specific spot. The headstone reads, "Pals." It marks the graves of Billy and two of his friends from the Lincoln County War, Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Bowdra. The word was chosen by people who knew them. Pat Garrett's grave is in Las Cruces, New Mexico, less than 2 hours away by the roads that exist now. Two men who rode together and were buried in the same state, in the same part of the country they both spent their lives navigating, less than 2 hours apart. Here is the part that stays with you. Billy the Kid was 21 years old when he died. Pat Garrett was 30. In the 9 years between those ages, Garrett had learned everything he knew about surviving in the specific world they both occupied from the younger man. The friendship was real. That isn't sentiment, it's documented by the people who were there. They shared money when money was scarce, which in that time and place was a more meaningful bond than most formal agreements. They operated together long enough and closely enough for the learning to go deep. And then the $500 bounty became a political calculation, and the political calculation became an election, and the election became a sheriff's star on Garrett's chest, and the sheriff's star meant that everything Billy had taught him was now pointed back at him. The trick worked in that bedroom at Fort Sumner because Garrett had learned it from the only man who could have taught it effectively, the man it was designed to stop. Billy couldn't read the room because the room already contained someone who knew how he read rooms. You can know everything about how someone survives and still lose to them because knowing isn't enough. And you can teach someone everything you know about survival and still be destroyed by it because the knowledge doesn't belong to you, once it's been given. That is the impossible part, not the shooting. The shooting was over in seconds. The impossible part is the 3 years before it. Two men, riding the same territory, and one of them is teaching the other man, patiently and precisely, exactly how to end him. Billy taught Pat Garrett his signature gun trick. The year was 1878. The student never forgot. Neither did history.